Welcome to the Professional Technical Interviewee. I'm Taylor Dorsett. In my 6-year career in technical recruiting, I realized that just about every company does technical interviews differently. Many very good senior engineers do not do well in technical interviews, despite being great developers. The only way to get better at interviewing is to practice. Many early career engineers don't really know what a technical interview is like until they're in their first one. Our goal here is to change that and shed some light on the technical interview. My guest today is Jay Wengrow. He's the founder of Actualize Coding Bootcamp and a former software engineer and teacher. We talk through a number of helpful interview tips for early career engineers. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Jay. Welcome to the show here. How are you?
I'm good. Excited to do this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay, we've known each other for quite a number of years, but I'll introduce you. Jay is the founder and CEO of Actualize Coding Bootcamp, which is, if I remember correctly, the longest running bootcamp in Chicago.
It is.
And Jay also wrote a book, which I have here, The Common Sense Guide to Data Structures and Algorithms. And before starting Actualize, you're actually a developer yourself here in Chicago. I'm a teacher before that, so quite the credentials.
For what I do now, I suppose so.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned we've known each other for quite a while. I actually worked at Actualize a number of years ago in kind of the director of outcomes role, helping students kind of land their first job. And then when I was learning to code, went through the program and learned from Peter, who's one of the lead. I guess I call him lead instructor, but he's, I think, dean of students as well.
Yeah, he is. He wears many hats,
Yeah.
but he is the dean and a lead instructor.
Yeah. Great. Well, can you share just a little bit about Actualize and kind of the team there?
Sure. Started Actualize in 2014. Actually, at the time, it was called Anyone Can Learn to Code. We rebranded to Actualize a couple of years later. Started it just by me teaching people web development, software engineering. I wrote the curriculum and taught it. I went through a few cohorts teaching it, sort of refining the curriculum. And after about a year and a half of doing that, we started hiring lead instructors who would teach the same curriculum, although they've already optimized it further to the point of where it's no longer recognizable to me, which is just fine. That's a good thing. So we have a number of lead instructors. Pre-pandemic, we taught classes both on site here in Chicago and the River North campus, as well as online over Zoom. I say we've been doing Zoom before it was cool. So since 2017, we've been doing the same class over Zoom as well. It's fully live. But now currently, all the classes are over Zoom. We do hope to restart the on-site classes when the time is right. Unknown when that is.
Right. Yeah, I think right when I was moving into a different role outside of Actualize was when I think those online live classes had started. So it'd been years in the making, right?
2017. Yeah. In addition to lead instructors, we also have career support staff who are dedicated to helping the students, the graduates, succeed at finding new roles as well. And then of course, there's the admissions and marketing and stuff like that. It's a small team or a small company.
Yeah,
but mighty.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I'm curious because I know it's probably been many years since you were in technical interviews yourself. But I guess I'm also interested because I don't think I was ever really a part of hiring instructors there. I'm curious, what does interviews look like internally, or have you done any technical interviews in recent years?
Yeah, so I did do sort of the standard technical interviews back when I was a developer. Even though I wasn't the hiring manager per se, I was part of those interviews as just sort of like a colleague developer kind of thing. Then currently for hiring lead instructors, we do give a technical portion. Primarily what we're looking for there is their ability to teach it. So we say, hey, here's this concept, make a short video lesson teaching it. So we're looking for not just their technical know-how, but also their ability to clarify a concept, ability to express their enthusiasm and charisma. Those are all important. But I also have given mock interviews, sort of the classic, what you call whiteboarding algorithm kind of interviews too. And those obviously are not for the sake of hiring, but we offer that to grads. Currently, I'm not doing the mock interviews, but I did it not too far in the past, and actually we'll be starting it up again as well.
Mhm.
So definitely very into interviews and stuff.
Yeah, the teaching portion that you mentioned when you're interviewing internally, that's something that I think stuck out to me about Actualize years ago, is that everyone there, including yourself, right, has worked professionally as a teacher and then also a software developer, right, which is something
Yeah,
that I felt was so unique because when I think of boot camps, I think I may be able to pick this information up on my own, but it might just take me a year, 2 years. But going through a boot camp, we're really trying to accelerate that timeline, right? And I think
yeah.
having someone who's actually a good teacher and who loves teaching at their core is probably going to have much more success, right, than just having someone who's a software developer who's going, I'll try to teach 30 people at once, right?
That's exactly right, which that could lead to disaster. I mean, yeah, people will pick it up. It's not hard to hire a programmer, get them in front of the room and spew concepts, right? But yeah, like you said, we only hire lead instructors who have experience in education as well, because exactly according what you're saying, which is in order to teach people effectively and in a short amount of time, they need to be able to impart the concepts clearly, succinctly, because there's a lot. We're cramming a lot of material in a short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can I could
As you know, yeah,
testament to that. Yeah. As far as evaluating, I guess, what are you typically evaluating for, kind of looking for in technical interviews? I know you said internally there's a teaching aspect to it, right? But when you're doing mock interviews, or even when you were interviewing for candidates in the past, when you were working as a developer, what are you looking for?
yeah, yeah. So when we were looking for developers back when I was a developer, there's really sort of a distinction between like the early career devs versus those with more experience. With the early career devs, the big thing that we're looking for is attitude. If faced with a challenge, will they just stare at it blankly and not be able to move forward in any way? Or are they eager to tackle the problem? Like the problem may be beyond them, it may be beyond their capability, but are they eager to tackle it? Are they doggedly persistent and trying different angles? Like they may run into a total brick wall, but there's two different types of people. There are people who will run into that brick wall and then stare at the wall. Or there are people who are like, okay, let me backtrack and try a different angle and keep on trying different things, because those people will succeed as developers.
Mhm.
Part of that is part of finding a different path is starting to engage me in a conversation, ask for help, say, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think about this approach? That's totally fair. In real life, a developer is going to ask for help. Even
Mhm.
experience does have to ask others for help. And also looking for humility, because without humility, someone's not going to grow.
Yeah.
So looking for those things. I mean, that's the early career devs. For more experience, we're looking for all those things too. But on top of that, looking to see their thought process, the things that I call, so at Actualize, we emphasize the 4 Ds. Three of those are relevant for here: decomposition, debugging, discovery. We want to see that they can decompose a problem, even if they can't
Mhm.
nail this particular exercise we're throwing at them. But can they break it down into smaller parts and sort of chew away at those? Debugging is the second D. Can they get unstuck? It's connected to the running into the brick walls, like I said before. Can they see you know, can they try a new angle? Can they get out of being stuck? And then
Yeah.
the third is discovery. Can they learn new things? Do they want to learn new things? Are they willing to try new things? Sometimes someone who's a developer for a long time is tired of learning new things, and that's sort of a real Achilles heel.
Yeah, I think it's something that I realized, or I really didn't realize when I was in recruiting, until I switched into engineering, was just how much of the job is not knowing something and then having to go find that information somewhere, right?
Yeah,
And that's just, I think, a foreign concept for a lot of people, and especially if you think of engineering, or at least even I worked very closely with software developers, right? I thought, well, these people just know how to do this, right? And I think really at the core, some of the best developers are people who go, oh, I don't know how to do that, but it'll be interesting to learn, right? And then they can
absolutely.
go figure that out.
That's really the hallmark of a good developer. I guess there's more than one hallmark, but that is definitely one of the top ones. The ability
Yeah.
to or the wanting to learn, the understanding you have to learn, being willing to reach out for help, and even the most senior people. It's impossible to know everything. It's impossible to know even 1% of everything there is to know. There's so much
Yeah.
to learn, and that's why you have other people who can show you the way.
Yeah. And Peter, who we mentioned earlier, is one of the lead instructors at Actualize. He phrased it interestingly, when we were talking about is debugging, right? Basically you're running into an error, and he said
Yeah.
if every time you see the error you go, God, and you're like you're screaming into the air, right? Like you're going to be frustrated constantly, because that's what the job is, right? Like so often you're
Yes.
trying to work through errors, and you really don't know the answer right off the top of your head. He said,
Yeah.
but instead you can think of it like you're almost, you're a detective, right? Or you're like Sherlock, and you're trying to figure out, great, interesting, let's see if I can kind of peel off one piece of this, right, and maybe
Yeah.
get one step further. And that was a hugely eye-opening to me. And even now when I get frustrated, not even debugging, maybe just in the early stages of building something, I try to think, okay, this is part of the process, let's look at this as a learning and kind of a enjoyment thing, because this is the job, right, rather
Yeah.
than just coding something and it works perfectly and you're done. Right.
Yeah. I've never like analyzed it statistically, but I wouldn't be surprised if a developer's job, they spend more time in their day debugging than they do actually writing code. I mean, I think that's almost certainly true for most developers,
Yeah,
which is why
absolutely.
it's sort of a tangent. It's like people like, try to rig their keyboards and stuff and text editors so they can type the fastest, which is great. But like most of the bottleneck is not the typing.
Mhm.
Your bottleneck, your speed and effectiveness as a developer is not based on how fast you can type at all. Most of your time is thinking, getting
Mhm.
unstuck, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as having a standardized system to be able to actually evaluate people in similar ways. I know, again, if you're doing mock interviews, you said kind of that there's those three Ds that you walk through. Do you have any type of standard grading criteria or like feedback system that you're trying to work through that you can give people to say, you need to improve more on X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, and this will vary based on whether we're talking about the mock interviews versus, let's say, the interviews I did back as a developer.
Hmm.
With the mock interviews, we provide the grads with training on a specific format, how I want them to do the mock interviews. And maybe we'll touch on this later. I think you're going to ask me something about this. Um, but I have a very specific format of how I want them to approach it. And what we're looking for is not even so much their ability to solve a problem, as much as we're looking for how they stick to that framework. Like, well, again, we'll probably touch on it later, but like one of the biggest mistakes people do, let's say in a whiteboarding interview, is to start writing code like quickly, like
Hmm.
immediately. Um, like one of the things you have to do is really plan out the algorithm. Again, we'll talk about it later probably, but making sure someone does that. If someone starts writing code right away, like I'm like, stop, hold everything. Um, let's do more planning. So stuff like that. With regards to uh, as a developer interviewing people, there's a lot of different things we're looking for. I mean, one of the things is just like, am I willing? Because a lot of what we did there wasn't so much whiteboarding, but pure programming. And in that case, like a lot of what we had in our heads, like, this is what it's going to feel like to work with this person in real life. Do I want to do that long term? That's certainly part of it. But looking for if they, I mean, a lot of these things, a lot of um, tech. I mean, one part of it, I don't know if you consider this a technical interview, but a big piece of it is just the conversation,
Yeah.
asking them about what projects they've done in the past. I mean, it's not like purely technical, but it can be very technical because if they're describing the technical aspects of the projects they've done, then we sort of dig into those. Show me what you've done. I'd say like that's the most important thing is like getting a sense, at least for the more experienced devs, like what have you done? What projects can you show me? How did it work? What technologies did you use? What struggles, challenges did you run into? And from there, we get a sense of like what they're capable of. They can show us like, oh, I can do this. I built this. I built that. These are the things I can do. Doing like the pair programming or a whiteboarding interview to me is more like a sanity check, like just to make sure they're not just lying and
Sure.
making things up. Like, so to me, that's more the pair programming is like, is the sanity check, like, is this person actually telling the truth that they know how to code? And also like, do I feel like I'd want to work with this person?
Yeah, it's funny. That's another thing that I certainly took for granted. Coming from recruiting was just realizing that some people haven't thought through like here's how to present the information, right? Or here's how to present what I've done over the last couple of years. Because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times when you're talking to a recruiter in that first conversation, often they don't really know the technology, and even some of the managers you may be interviewing with, right, other people you may be interviewing with don't know the specific technologies that you're using, right? So if you just say I've built X, right, or I've been using a lot of Ruby on Rails, they might go, okay, but what does that really mean, right? But I think some of the really helpful feedback I got when I was right out of the boot camp was an engineering manager who I was talking to said, if you can distill your projects, like basically what you've actually used and kind of the impact you had on those projects with the
Mm-hmm.
technologies that you used in 2 sentences, he's like, then I know at least you have the capacity to do that, right? He's like,
Yeah,
and then we can work from there. But if you just say, oh, I've been using Ruby on Rails, right? He's like, I don't know
yeah,
what that means. Right? That could be
yeah,
anything.
yeah. Means you could have like typed in a single command to start a new Rails app, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Um, I'm curious. We've talked a little bit about technical interviews. I mean, in the past, how do you think you do at technical interviews? Before we even started recording, you said you thought originally that I was going to ask you a technical question at the end of this, the
yeah.
second half of the podcast. So, I mean, I commend you on being willing to do that still. So you must feel at least somewhat okay about technical interviews.
Yeah. Well, I think I would, I have a very specific approach to how I break things down and how I approach the problem. So I know
Mhm.
how to stick to that framework. As to whether I'd solve the problem, um, so again, there's so many different kinds of technical interviews. Like the conversational technical interview, that's fine for me. If we're talking about like a leak code, problem, some of these notorious things from like cracking the coding interview book,
Mhm.
we're talking about that, I'd probably not do great. I think I could do great if I practiced those things.
Sure.
And that's sort of ironic because I just wrote, this book on data structures and algorithms. But being able to nail a hard lead code problem in a short period of time is something you have to really practice. So this is not something I've practiced recently. So I'd probably do pretty poorly, I'd say, on actually nailing the problem, which is fine by me. It's not something I'm seeking to do at
Mhm.
this time. I'm not interviewing at Google. Um, quite happy doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think something that was actually really helpful. I think you put this out. It was kind of a list of like some basic questions that are often seen that
Yeah.
was available to Actualize graduates, and that was something that I started working my way through them. And I think it was mostly just kind of arrays, hash maps. There was some number based problems, maybe some ETL problems, and a lot of those I realized, oh, I'm getting these same 10-ish questions in every technical interview that I went into, right?
Okay.
And just learning the basics of kind of these are problems you'll commonly see was hugely helpful. And then I think everything, I would have one or two interviews that were like maybe those leak code hard or leak code medium questions that I just
Yeah.
went, if I was actually talking to someone like doing this type of interview or I was coding along with them, we could work to something, right? Like I could show that I understood the problem and maybe they would give me enough help we could work through it.
Yeah.
But very often, if it was just here's a hacker rank and it was me alone, I go, "Ah, that's gonna be tough,
Sure.
right?"
Yeah. So that list of exercises, which I call algorithm ladder, it's the Trello board of these exercises. And also I put in some videos of me demonstrating specific concepts, including my whiteboarding approach. Um, so that that uh, that list of exercises was meant to be sort of like pre-leak code, like
Mhm.
because I could see like grads jumping right into leak code, and I'm like, actually, you're just not ready for this quite
Yeah.
yet. I mean, some are, but some aren't. I'm like, and you'll get there. You'll get there quickly. But that Trello board was to sort of like do these first.
Mhm.
Once, and they're not that hard, but once you can do them, then you'll be ready for some of those more challenging ones.
100%. I would say I worked through all of those and then
Great.
felt much more comfortable being able to do actual leak code problems because it is intimidating where you go, great, I know how to code now. And then you go out to try to do practice problems and you're like, what's going on? I don't even know what they're asking me. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So that can be very stressful. Right. But I mean, the whole part of the whole goal of this podcast and actually too, to some extent, is showing if you practice something, you can consistently get better at it. Right.
for sure, for sure.
And
And
interviewing is a whole different piece than actual programming, right? Often.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the good news also is that it's not like all interviews are leak code
Mhm.
kind of interviews. I mean, I've spoken to many graduates of our program, and I mean, the variety of coding interviews is just all over the place. It
Mhm.
could be a mere pair programming. It could be build this thing as a take-home project. It could be, I mean, people have had really simple. People have been in a situation where they weren't even asked technical questions, like real technical questions beyond like what have you done,
Mhm.
um, or like really simple ones like, hey, how would you um, get a value out of an array? And it's like, well, if the array's variable is stored, it's in, let's say, a variable called x, and it's x square bracket 0 would give you the first item in the array. Like that was it. That was the interview.
Mhm.
Like really basic. So it's not all about, grinding through the cracking the coding interview book and leak code. There's so much more out there, and that's why just keep getting more and more interviews. And um, even if you're not fantastic at leak code, that's fine. You're going to eventually get interviews that are easier.
Mhm. Yeah, my first job was very much, it was conversational all throughout. Was the interview process, and I think my technical interview was walking through some code I had on GitHub,
Yeah,
and then at the end he was like, "Well, I mean, you know what you're doing enough to work on these couple projects that we have." So
exactly. Yeah,
it makes
that's
good
great.
sense.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a huge soapbox about how I think, like, I mean, especially the leak code technical interviews, like it's a really broken system. I mean, a lot, I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. I mean, the someone put it well, is like the fact that there's a book called Cracking the Coding Interview implies that you need a special skill to do the interview. There should just be books on how to code, right? The interview should reflect, like, if you can do this in the interview, what you do in the interview should reflect what you do on the job. It
Mhm.
shouldn't be its own subject. That means the interview is not connected to the job. And someone could even do well on that kind of problem, but be terrible in the real world.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's a
I
different.
I used to say, I think Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, that who are notorious for those types of like
Yeah,
hardcore whiteboarding interviews, they're not really trying to hire the best programmers. They're trying to hire the best programmers who will spend 50 to 200 hours studying for their interview process, right?
hmm,
And like that shows you're probably going to stick around there longer than the average person who might get frustrated at a company like that who's going to say work on X, right?
yeah, yeah. So I think the good news is that, I mean, I don't know the statistics, but many, many, many companies, maybe the majority, are not that. It's not those kind of notorious interviews.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you touched on it a little bit, but what system do you use when you're decomposing a problem, or basically you come into an interview and someone says, "Great, solve this," right? I guess, can
Yeah.
you walk me through that system?
Yeah. So it's truly a system. I'm always tweaking it a little bit. And the system isn't so much for me, it's what we use to train our grads or our students. It used to be a 5-point system. Now it's a 6-point system. I'm still working on an acronym for it. I'm usually good with coming up with that kind of stuff, but this one is beyond me. Anyway, so I wrote it down. I have it in front of me. So there's 6 steps for. I mean, this is, again, there's so many different kinds of interviews. But if we're talking about like having to write an algorithm on a whiteboard,
Mm-hmm.
then these are the 6 steps. The first is to confirm the problem with the interviewer. Make sure you understand it. If they're asking you to write a function, you should actually write out an example of
Mm-hmm.
like, well, if I receive this input, then I should do the outputs. And you turn to the interviewer and it's like, is that what you had in mind?
Yeah.
And then you should also, beyond that, maybe this is the 7th step. See, then I'll never find an acronym if I had too many steps. But if another thing is like trying to find the edge cases, like, and don't just do like, if someone says, do something with this array of numbers, don't just make your array of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because you have to think about, well, what if my array is not sorted? What
Mm-hmm.
if there are negative numbers in this array, assuming the array had numbers in it? Trying to, and sort of working out like, well, if that was the input, then this should be the output. And again, confirming everything with the interviewer. So that's the first step. The second step is to find patterns. And this, depending on how this, there's more to do in this area if the problem is more complex. But I mean, I would go all out in doing lots of different examples of inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it was a question involving an array, I would start writing out like 5 different arrays and making it. There's 2 things you get with that. One is that you get very comfortable with the problem, and you get very comfortable with what they're asking you to do. Okay, you're like nailing it. Like, okay, with this input, I'm supposed to get that output. With this input, I'm supposed to get that output. You get very comfortable with that. But also, you can start to look for patterns and saying, well, I see every time that we have inputs like this, the outputs are like that. Every time the array is sorted, we get this kind of output. Or if there are negative numbers, we get that kind of output. I mean, I'm describing things very vaguely because there's so many different kinds of problems. But looking for patterns among the different kinds of inputs and outputs. And in the last chapter of my book, I actually like use concrete examples to show what I mean by that. The third step is the most important step, and I've used different terms for this. I used to call it visualization. Now I'm just calling it strategizing. And this is, to me, the most important step, and the step that one should spend the most time on.
Mm-hmm.
More than any other step, even the coding step. People think like most of their time on a whiteboarding interview should be coding. And to me, that's a mistake. To me, what someone needs to do is spend most of their time on the strategizing of the problem and coming up with the algorithm that is going to solve the problem. So if we're talking about like reversing a string, and
Mm-hmm.
this is where whiteboard is good. Like, people ask the question of like, why would you ever write code on a whiteboard that's so unrealistic? And the answer is you're right. It's unrealistic for writing code, but that's not what you want to use the whiteboard for. Use the whiteboard for what it's good for, which is drawing visualizations and saying, if I'm going to reverse a string, then here's my characters, and I'm going to start using arrows and drawing things and saying, well, if I use a loop, then I can do this, and then
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with the empty string and whatever. Or what if I start from the end of the string and work backwards, and you start coming up with the strategy. And even along with that, you can write simple one-liners. Like if you're deciding like what loop you're going to use, you're saying, okay, I'm gonna use a loop that starts from the end of the string. So how do I write that out in code? You'll write a one-liner like, while whatever,
Yeah.
X is greater than, or blah, 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 blah. And you can write that out as I mean, now we're getting into like pseudocode, but like, to me, it's like when I write this out, it looks like a beautiful mind kind of thing, where I have like that whole, to me, like that's where someone's to spend the most of their time. Once you do that and you're clear on what the algorithm is, then writing the code goes so fast.
Mhm.
Then then it's just a matter of recalling the right syntax and just writing it out. And then, so those, that's how I break down a problem. The final two steps, like for the interview, are to then check your work,
Mhm.
which the way you do that is to pretend you're like the computer and you're parsing every line by line of the code, and you can like write on the side what the value of every variable is at a given
Yeah.
moment in time. Like if you're working through a loop, then you're saying, okay, at this point X is 1, and then the next time, okay, now you cross it out, rub it out, and X is 2. Again, that's what a whiteboard is good for. And you check your work and make sure that by the end, the output of that function is what you had hoped it would be. And then the
Mhm.
final step is just, what I call refactor. You just take a step back and look at what you've done and say, like, is this the most efficient way of doing it? Being able to express, if you understand big O notation, I think it's all described in my book. Big O notation is really easy, actually, if you just if it's explained to you well. So I recommend for people who want to know about big O notation to check out my book.
I
And
think I
then
told you I
go
looked
ahead.
at Big O 1,000 times trying to understand it well, and then I read your book and it actually finally clicked, which was
Great.
very useful because I was like, I don't understand why I don't get this thing, but I
Yeah,
think it's not explained well very often.
yeah. I think a lot of these things aren't explained well, but they're not really complex concepts. So being able to express, like, okay, I've done this algorithm. It looks like it's running, O of n squared. And then you can try to think, is there a way I can do this better? If you could think of a better way, you can start describing that to the interviewer. Depending how much time there is, they'll let you, try to implement that.
Mhm.
Um, and even if not, just being able to express, like, okay, this is what it is. This is my algorithm. This is, it's big O runtime or whatever, if you want to add space complexity or whatever. Being able to express that is a big deal. And if you can improve it or make the code, more elegant, it's another thing someone could try to do. Sorry, I went on that was a long ramble, but that's like a thing. You asked me a question of like where I actually have a system for.
Yeah.
So
So just to confirm, it's confirming the problem with the interviewer. It's basically to ensure you actually understand that, and then maybe adding some edge cases
yeah,
to that problem, finding the patterns, basically using as many examples of like inputs and outputs as possible, so you actually get comfortable with the problem more than
yeah,
just understanding it, and
yeah,
then strategizing, which is, it sounds like almost includes pseudocode to some extent, but basically, what are you going to use to solve this problem, right? So you're not trying to think through that while you're actually writing the code, right?
exactly. It's impossible to develop not impossible, but it's very hard to develop an algorithm and write the code for it
Yeah,
simultaneously. It's like asking someone to write two different things with each of their hand at the same time.
yeah,
So like strategize, develop the algorithm. What is the algorithm? It's going to be a loop. It's going to be a loop within a loop, whatever it is. I'm going to use a hash table to store this, and I'm going to then use the loop and store it. Like just develop what the algorithm is. Yeah, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. And then fourth, check your work to make sure you know what you're trying to do is actually happening, right?
Yeah, or
And
fourth
then
is coding. Actually write the code.
actually coding, right?
Yeah,
I knew I missed one.
yeah.
The that one, the little one, actually write the code.
Yeah,
And
and
then
then
check your work and then refactor.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, great. Well, I wrote them all down, so that's what I'm going to use when we go to do the technical, to make sure
Okay.
I think I use, it's a close-ish. I would say maybe a modified version. I would say I try to um, decompose for the most part, and then similarly to the strategize. I don't think I would have put it in that term, but I do think that's what I'm trying to do, and it might make more sense for me in the future to actually think of spending more time on that section, because usually I'll say I'm going to solve this using X, right, and then kind of sketch out what I'm going to do and then try to go into it.
Right. And everyone has to know themselves. And, I can't tell everyone the best way to think. Like someone knows how they think better than I do. Like everyone knows themselves. So I can't say that these are absolute hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, I do see that people do much better in the mock interviews I give when they pause to strategize. And I will also like say like most people think they're done strategizing and they're ready to move on to the code, and 99% of the time they're not. Because I already see where they're gonna fall flat.
Sure.
And I'd say, hey, they start writing code or like def, whatever. I'm like, actually, why don't you strategize further? And then I'll start prodding them a little bit. I'm like, well, what are you
Yeah.
gonna do? What are you gonna do when it gets to the end of the loop or whatever? Or like if I, whatever it is I'm seeing. Or like what kind of loop are you gonna use? Anyway, go ahead.
I try to ask a lot of, does that make sense to you? After I present kind of what I'm going to do. And I mean, most people will say either, yeah, that's what I would do, or maybe try this. Once in a while, you get, just the stone wall that doesn't say anything. But
Those are the worst. Yeah,
yeah, it's tough. But at least it's worth asking, right?
for sure, for sure. I definitely recommend trying to turning these things into a conversation. I can talk more about that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I was going to ask. I mean, this is a great system, and I think hugely important for people, especially. What's the Mike Tyson quote? It's like everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people don't walk into interviews with a plan. I just think it is important to have some type of system in place because, I mean, I think I've had maybe one person on the show so far who was like, I just feel very comfortable in technicals. I love whiteboarding, and like most other people don't love that, and it's a learned skill set. And if you at least have something in place, so when you see that problem, I don't know how to solve this off the top of my head. Great. Now what do I need to do? Right? Like let's actually have a plan instead of just going into like scared, terrified mode, because I think that's where it's easy to get trapped in an interview.
yeah, yeah. And the two things I'd add besides my official 6-point system um, is to make it a conversation. This isn't like your final exam in high school. This is them also trying to get to know you, and you'll seem really stiff if you're just like silent and writing. So there's I mean, besides making it a conversation, because like engage them and try to talk to them. It doesn't, you can ask for some feedback, like you said in the middle, like, does this make sense? Is this,
Mhm.
but also definitely talk your way through your thought process the
Yeah.
entire time. Like you should not be silent. Um, even if you feel you're at a brick wall, then just explain the brick wall.
Mhm.
Explain, this is why I'm stuck, because I realize that if I whatever, if when I move forward in the loop, then and I'm adding the characters to the string, I end up with the same string again instead of it being in reverse. And just
Mhm.
talk it through. And they're like, well, maybe if I do, let's just keep talking. Which is hard. It's hard to do. It's also like trying to do things at once, think and talk at the same time. You're allowed to pause, but um, I would say talk through your thought process, because anyway, that's the main thing they want to see. For
Mhm.
in many of these cases, it's they're not, maybe at Google it's different, but in many interviews, they're not looking, it's not a matter of you solving the problem. It's not a binary thing. Like if you solve the problem, you get the job. And if you don't solve the problem, you don't get the job. They're trying to learn about you, know who you are, see how you think. And you can demonstrate all those things by talking through your thought process, even if you don't nail the actual problem and don't solve it
Mhm.
correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do you have any other advice or tips for engineers who are in technical interviews or maybe preparing for technical interviews?
Yeah, I'd say do mock interviews with other people. Ask people to mock interview. I know there's these services. I can't speak to them. I haven't tried them out. There's something called Pramp. I know that
Mhm.
everyone's talking about an online service where I think there's some free versions where you can actually get a live random developer to interview you. Um, you know, even though the actual content of the interview that you might get on there is different than what you have in real life, but at least you get the feel of what it's like to code while you're nervous,
Yeah.
right? While you're in front of a stranger. Um, definitely, uh, definitely do some mock interviews beforehand.
Yeah, Skilled is another one. I know the
Yeah.
founder there. They have a great service, and I think they package in like doing a resume as well, and then also they'll give
Mhm.
you like, here's the feedback on your mock interview and what you should improve on before. I think they have like packages to do a couple mock interviews, and
Yeah.
if you can't find that or can't afford something like that, I know there's plenty of people, especially in smaller tech communities, right? Like in Chicago, there's a tech Slack. I'm sure if you post it on there, hey, I'm looking to do a mock interview to prepare for interviews, probably be people who would be happy to do mock interviews with you, right? Because they're
Yeah.
kind of fun if you're the interviewer, right? Like that, and then you get to know someone a little bit too. So I'm sure
Sure.
people would be willing to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Would do you have the same advice or maybe different advice for early career engineers?
I would say all of the above. I'd add a few more points, especially for early career engineers. Um, know that you're going to get the job eventually. You just need to stay persistent. Know in advance that you're going to bomb some interviews. It's not like if, but it's when. You will bomb interviews. Know that that's totally normal and part of the process, because many people can think they bomb the first interview and they're like, I'm a bad programmer. I never realized that. I thought I was pretty good, and now I realize I'm bad. That you're not bad. You're not a bad programmer. That's part of the process. You'll bomb an interview. I would bomb interviews on data structures and algorithms, even though I wrote a book on it. That's just part of the process. If you keep on getting more and more interviews, you'll eventually get that job. I mean, you'll also get better at interviewing, right? You'll also increase your odds of getting an easier interview because there's so many
Mhm.
different types of interviews. You'll eventually get it. You'll eventually do it. Don't ever think that an interview reflects on your skill. It really doesn't. And eventually you'll find the right fit.
Yeah, I mean, the whole premise of this show is that interviewing, one, is hard, and then two, every company interviews differently, right? So that's,
For sure.
you could run into who knows what at any point in your career, especially early career. I do feel like the variance was really high of like, oh, they want me to reverse a string. That's it. Versus like, oh, they want me to code in a language I don't know and a problem that's probably much too difficult for me. Like those interviews could happen in the same week or sometimes even the same day, which definitely is a roller coaster of emotions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I was interviewing, I encountered all different types of interviews. And like I said, when I speak to Actualize grads, I hear like wildly different experiences,
Sure.
from like I said, like, how do you use an array to like develop this maze algorithm? Like, it's like, it's all over the place.
Oh yeah, I had a company that said we want you to get as close to a fully functional Facebook as possible. I'm like, that was the take home, and I was like, I don't have 20 hours, 40
Yeah.
hours to do
I mean, it
this.
just so happens that Facebook has what, like a couple thousand programmers.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
just a it's crazy. So, my other tip for people is, especially early career people, is write down the problems that you get, because I did start seeing trends over and over again. And the most frustrated I think I ever was interviewing was when I had been asked a problem one week and then the next week got basically the exact same problem, maybe just slightly different, and I hadn't figured out how to solve it in
Yeah.
between. And then I was very frustrated where I went, oh, I could have learned how to solve that type of problem. So that's
Right.
something I advise people to do, just so you'll start to see trends very often.
Yeah. I mean, I laughed so hard when a grad described to me the interview they had, and it was to do fizz buzz, but it was a cleverly or not so cleverly disguised fizz buzz. It was like, if the number is divisible by three,
Yeah,
write apple. And if it's divisible by five, write orange. I'm like, let's fizz buzz. He's like, I know, I aced it.
it's funny. My first technical was the guy goes, so you do you know are you do you understand FizzBuzz? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, all right, then code it. And I was like, all right. And then the next question was basically the same thing, but also finding if it was a multiple of something else. And I was like, okay, this was fun.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on, I mean, any interviewing horror stories that you have, maybe personally when you were at the whiteboard or on the other side of the table that you're willing to share?
Sure. You know, looking back, it wasn't a horror story, but at the time it felt like one. This was an interview I had where I was interviewing for a developer position. It was on Google Hangouts. This was pre-Zoom. I was in like the basement in my home, and it was three faces interviewing me, three little boxes, and then there was like a Google Doc on top that had some of these like reverse a string kind of problems. I believe reverse a string was actually the first one. I also, at the time, knew nothing about technical interviewing. Like this was my position after some internships where I never had to go through that. So I didn't even know like this was a thing. I never heard of being asked to reverse a string. You know, to me, it's so obvious. I know so much about this now that it's so funny to me that I didn't at the time. And I walked right into this interview. And so, and I'm the type of person who gets nervous and I can easily freeze up in these kinds of things. So it was like reverse a string, which isn't that hard, but I start to freeze up. I start like typing and I see like everyone moving in, which is just so intimidating because like you're seeing your code and their faces simultaneously, and you're watching their slight facial reactions and twitches to like every character and keystroke you do. And like at some point I'm like backspacing and I see them frowning and I'm like, it was so the nice thing about real whiteboarding is that you're not facing their faces while you're working at it. But on Google Hangouts, you're seeing their faces while you're, if you do a remote thing like that, put their faces away, like hide them so you don't see their facial reaction as you're doing it. When I got to like the third problem, which is I think the most complex one, like I really started to freeze up, and the whole thing was so intimidating to me, and I started saying to myself, like my self-talk was really negative. I'm like, you know what, Jay, you're in the comfort of your own home and they're intruding on you. They have no right to intrude on you like this. Just unplug your computer. Just unplug it. Like they weren't even part of the company per se. They were like an outsourced thing in Texas they used for the interview. I'm like, they have no right to intrude on me like this. Just unplug the computer. But thankfully I didn't do that. I took a deep breath and just went on. And even though I felt like I didn't do a good job in the interview, which I think is true, I think I did like just okay. I actually got the job and I took it. So you never know.
You go.
Never know. So in the end, it wasn't a horror story, but at the time, it was sweating bullets.
That's great. I think many people can relate. I forgot how to make a function in my first technical. The same one I was mentioning, the fizzbuzz. I was like, easy. I know how to do fizzbuzz. And then I was like, I don't know how to create a function. Like I literally can't do this right now. So
yeah,
it's easy to freeze up in
it's so easy to freeze up. I mean, someone can ask me the alphabet. I mean, I'll probably get that. But some really easy questions, if you freeze up, it's hard to do even the easy things. So that's why, again, going on more interviews will help you not freeze up, because you'll get used to the feeling of what it's like to be in that position.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. As a reminder, this interview has 2 parts. You can find the second half, which is the live technical interview, on YouTube at The Professional Technical Interviewee. The link will be in the show notes. Until next time, keep practicing.